She steps off a train with one bag, and by sunset, the whole town is talking about her, but not for the reason you'd think. Picture this. A woman travels for 3 days by train, holding on to a letter that promised her a new life, a new husband, a new start. And the second she steps onto the platform, the man who sent for her looks her in the eye, and changes his mind. In front of everyone. That's exactly how this story starts. And what happens next is the kind of quiet, slow-burn redemption that'll stick with you long after the video ends. So let's get into it. Her name was Clara Voss, and she was 25 years old the day the train pulled into that little dust-colored town. She'd spent the last 3 years of her life at the orphanage where she'd grown up, taking in sewing work, saving every coin she could get her hands on, waiting for something, anything, that felt like a future. When the letter came asking for a bride, she didn't hesitate. She read it twice, signed her name, and spent her very last coin on the ticket that would carry her toward a man she'd never met. She was the last one off the train that day. Her dress had been pressed neat before the journey, but 3 days on a rattling coach had beaten that neatness right out of it. Her bag was small. Her hands hung loose at her sides. And her chin was level, held high, the way a woman holds her chin when she's already decided, before she even steps off that train, that she is not going to fall apart in front of strangers. Waiting for her at the end of the platform was a man named Nathaniel Cross. He had a folded paper in his hand and a look on his face like a man who'd been rehearsing bad news for so long that all that rehearsing had only made it worse. See, Nathaniel had signed the paperwork with the marriage agency 8 months earlier. But somewhere between then and now, he'd changed his mind. And instead of writing her a letter, instead of sparing her the humiliation of finding out in front of half the town, he waited until she was standing right there on that platform, bag in hand, and told her he couldn't go through with it. Loud enough for people to hear. That was the cruelest part. Not the rejection itself, the audience. Clara stood there and let him finish. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. Her face did exactly what she needed it to do, which was nothing at all. Nathaniel held up those agency papers like they were some kind of deed, like paper could ever own a person. But everybody standing on that platform knew better. A woman is not land. She's not a plot you can stake a claim to. Still, he held those papers a moment longer than he needed to, like the weight of them in his hand made him feel like less of a coward. Then he folded them back into his coat and walked off without looking back. And just like that, the platform emptied out around her. Clara stood there alone with her bag at her feet, staring out at a town that had no idea what to do with her, and she had no idea what came next either. Now here's where the story turns. Across the street, a man was walking out of the hardware store with a paper bag of nails and fittings tucked under his arm. His name was Wade Colton. 32 years old, broad through the shoulders, hands rough from years of carpentry work, sawdust still clinging to his sleeve from that morning's job. He had the look of a man who'd been carrying something heavy for so long, he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to set it down. Wade stopped on the boardwalk step and looked over at the platform. He saw the empty space where a man had just walked away. He saw the bag at her feet. He saw her back, straight as a fence post, refusing to bend even though there was nobody watching anymore who mattered. And something about that, something about a woman standing alone and still holding herself together, made him cross the street. He stopped at the bottom of the platform steps and looked up at her. "Name's Wade Colton," he said. "I've got 2 kids and a house that needs looking after. I do carpentry 3 days a week, so most mornings you'd have the place to yourself." He held her gaze steady. "It'd just be temporary. Room and board, until you figure out what's next for you." Clara looked him over for a long moment, taking his measure the way you'd size up a stranger you're about to trust with your whole life. "Can you cook?" he asked. "I can," she said, meeting his eyes right back. And I'm not scared of hard work. She picked up her bag. Then let's go, she said. And that was it. No fanfare, no promises, just two strangers walking off a train platform together while the whole town watched and tucked the story away to gossip about later. Wade's place sat at the edge of town, a small cabin with a horse penned up on the side and a porch step that had clearly been meaning to get fixed for a very long time. Clara noticed it, but she didn't say a word. Inside, the front room was clean the way a house gets clean when it's run by a man living alone, functional, orderly, nothing soft about it anywhere. A workbench lined one wall. A stove worked steadily in the corner. And up on a shelf above the kitchen window sat a small wooden sewing basket, the kind that hadn't been touched in a long, long time. The kind everyone in that house had quietly agreed not to talk about. Wade told her the room off the kitchen was hers. Her own door. Her own space. The kids ate supper at 6. He ate whenever he made it back from work. That's when Eli came around the corner from the back of the house, moving with the exact timing of a boy who'd been listening somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. 10 years old, already built like his father through the shoulders, with a face that gave nothing away. He looked at Clara the way you look at something you've seen a version of before, and you're not ready yet to believe it might be different this time. Then he looked at his dad, turned, and walked right back the way he came without a single word. And that silence said more than anything he could have spoken out loud. Then came Josie. She didn't so much walk into the room as appear in it, 6 years old, one ribbon tied neat and the other one hanging loose, standing near the bedroom doorway watching Clara with the wide-open, unguarded attention that only little kids seem to have left in them, before life teaches them to hide what they're feeling. Clara looked back at her, calm and steady, nothing put on for show. "Are you hungry?" Clara asked. Josie thought about that seriously, like it was a real question that deserved a real answer. "A little bit." "Come help me see what's hiding in that pantry," Clara said. And Josie went to her without a second of hesitation. That first supper was simple: beans, cornbread, and a broth that somehow smelled a whole lot better than it had any right to, given what little was sitting in that pantry. The smell drifted through the whole house before anybody even sat down to eat. Wade came in from outside and paused just inside the door, and something crossed his face for a second before he tucked it away. Eli ate without saying much of anything. Josie's eyes kept bouncing back and forth between her bowl and Clara like she couldn't quite decide which one deserved more attention. Partway through supper, Josie set her spoon down and announced, matter of fact, that the last woman who tried to cook for them had burned everything she touched. Wade said her name, quiet, like a warning. But Josie just kept looking at Clara. "She really did," Josie said. "Burnt beans are a serious offense," Clara said, eyes on her plate, completely straight-faced. "I don't take that lightly." And Eli, quiet, guarded Eli, looked up. The corner of his mouth twitched, just barely, and then went right back to where it had been. He didn't say a word. But when supper wrapped up, he lingered at the table a little longer than he needed to before finally heading off to bed. Wade noticed. He didn't say anything either. But he noticed. The next morning, Wade stepped off the porch and that busted step held solid under his boot. He stopped. Pressed his foot down on it again just to be sure. Went inside, poured 2 cups of coffee, and left one sitting on the counter right where Clara was working. Nobody said a word about the step. Nobody said a word about the coffee. They just drank it together in that early morning quiet while the cold settled in around the house. On the 5th day, Eli decided to test her. He straight up didn't do the chore she'd asked him to do, and then he just waited to see what would happen. Clara appeared in the doorway. "Eli." "The wood." He looked up. "I was getting to it." "I know. Get to it now, please." He held her stare for a second, like he was looking for something specific in her face. And when he found it, he got up without another word and brought the wood in. She thanked him plainly and went right back to the kitchen like nothing had happened. Wade had heard the whole thing from his workbench. He set his plane down, sat with the quiet for a second, and then picked it right back up. From there, the days just started falling into place. Eli began sticking around the table after meals, whittling, reading, actually present in the room in a way he hadn't been before. Josie followed Clara from room to room like a devoted little shadow, helping wherever her small hands could reach and watching close wherever they couldn't. Wade started making it home from work at the exact same hour, every single evening, like clockwork. One night, Clara read to Josie from an old book of stories sitting on the shelf, doing all the voices without a hint of embarrassment. Josie leaned into her side with the total, unquestioning trust of a kid who's already made up her mind and has zero interest in changing it. Eli sat on the far side of the room, something small in his hands, not looking up, but not leaving either. Now here's a little moment that doesn't get talked about much in stories like this one, but it happened, and I think it matters. About 3 weeks in, an elderly neighbor named Ruth Alden showed up at Wade's door one afternoon with a torn quilt in her arms, asking if the new woman in town might know her way around a needle. Clara sat with Ruth for 2 hours that day, mending that quilt stitch by stitch while Ruth talked about her late husband, about the winters that used to be harder, about how nobody in this town had stopped by her place in months. Clara didn't fix Ruth's loneliness. She couldn't. But she listened, and she mended that quilt like it actually mattered, and when Ruth left, she wasn't just a stranger anymore, she was someone who'd stop by again. That's the kind of thing you don't see in most stories about tough beginnings and second chances. It's not the big dramatic moment. It's the small ones, stacked up quietly, one on top of another, that actually build a life. Clara wasn't just winning over one family. She was becoming part of a whole town, one small kindness at a time. By the time frost had settled into the mornings for good, Josie had stopped trailing behind Clara like a guest in the house and started trailing behind her like she belonged there. Like a kid trails her mother. It was an ordinary, gray morning when everything changed. Josie was crossing the kitchen in her socks, still warm from sleep, lost in her own little world, when she caught her foot on the threshold and went down hard on both hands. The sound she made was that startled cry kids make right before they decide whether or not this is worth crying over. She decided it was. Clara was on the floor with her before the tears even really started, holding both of Josie's little hands in hers, checking her palms, steady and calm, not rushing, not making a scene out of it. And Josie, without even meaning to say it, without even really thinking about it, said the one word that just happened to be true. Mama. It hit the room and just stayed there. Clara's hands didn't move. Not for one full breath. And then she gathered Josie in close and held her until the crying wore itself out, calm on the outside, giving absolutely nothing away about what that word had just done to her on the inside. Wade was standing in the bedroom doorway. He'd heard it too. He stood there with one hand braced on the frame, staring down at the hallway floor, not moving a muscle. Something was happening in him right then, and he kept his eyes fixed away from it, because you know how it is, some things change the second you actually look at them straight on. At the table, Eli had gone completely still. 10 years old, and he knew exactly what he'd just heard and exactly what it meant. And something in his face, something that had been closed off for a long, long time, started, slowly, working its way toward open. Wade went back into his room, sat on the edge of the bed, hand flat against his knee, and just stayed there while the morning moved quietly on around the house without him. Not everybody in town was thrilled about this new arrangement, though. A woman named Loretta Finch cornered Clara at the general store counter one Friday afternoon with that warm, rehearsed tone people use when they've prepared their concern ahead of time like a little speech. She talked about appearances. About what people were saying. About the natural shape a situation finds when you just leave it alone. About kids getting confused when they're given the wrong idea of what an arrangement really is. She picked her words like tools, each one built for exactly the job she wanted it to do. Then she left without buying a single thing. Clara set her coins on the counter, one at a time, and walked home. She was 25, and she'd already sat through enough conversations like that one to build up a pretty thick skin for it. She'd learned a long time ago that somebody else's opinion of you is not the same thing as the truth about you. She stood at the kitchen window that evening with her hands resting on the sill, looking out at the yard and the line of pine trees past it, staring at that flat winter sky a little longer than she really needed to. Then she got up and started supper like always. That night, Wade was at the stove and she was finishing up the dishes, and without even glancing up from the fire, he asked, "You doing all right?" She kept her hands in the water and actually thought about it before answering. "I am," she said. He gave a small nod at the fire and let it be. She went back to the dishes. And the room just settled back into its quiet around the both of them. About a month later, a man named Otis Vance was down at the saloon on a Tuesday evening, running his mouth the way men do at the end of a long day, easy, unhurried, no real harm meant by it. He mentioned that the Colton place seemed different lately. Smoke coming from the chimney at all the right hours. The kids seemed steadier than they'd been in a long time. And that woman from the platform, the one Nathaniel had left standing there in front of half the town, something about her, Otis said, had gotten those kids to open right up. Said the older one was coming around more. Said the little one had even started calling her mama. Nathaniel Cross was standing at the far end of the bar, and he went completely still. Otis kept right on talking, not noticing a thing, saying it was good to see some life back in that house again. Nathaniel stared at the row of bottles across from him. He still had those agency papers tucked in his coat. And he had a pride that had been sitting wrong with him ever since that day on the platform. Now a picture was forming in his head, warm light in the windows, kids settled and happy, smoke rising at all the right hours, a woman those kids had already started calling mama. He tossed some coins on the bar and stood up. "Where's the Colton place?" he asked. It was a cold, clear Thursday morning when Wade and Clara were walking out of the post office together. He'd gone to pick up a notice about lumber. She'd come along because the kids were at school and that's just how the morning had shaped up. And that's when Nathaniel stepped out into the middle of the street, agency papers in hand, voice pitched loud enough to carry. "The fees paid," he said. "The contract signed. An obligation doesn't just disappear because a woman decided she found somewhere more comfortable to sit." He held those papers up like they were some kind of deed, even though everybody standing on that street knew exactly what they actually were. Then he said the word, "mine," and the whole street heard it land. Everything went still. A woman near the dry goods store stopped in her tracks. Two men outside the feed store turned to look. The cold air seemed to hold the whole street frozen in place. Clara stood next to Wade. She didn't step back. She didn't even look at Nathaniel. She just held herself the exact same way she'd held herself on that platform months ago, straight, unshaken, not finished, except this time, there was somebody standing right next to her, and the whole street could see plain as day that he wasn't going anywhere. Wade looked at the papers. Looked at Nathaniel. Then he turned to Clara, voice low and even. "Stay here." Not an order. The kind of thing you say to someone you fully intend to come right back to. He walked to the bank. For minutes later, he came back out with money he'd had tucked away under the floorboards for 2 years straight, every last cent he'd been saving toward buying back into a proper ranch of his own. Slow, patient work. A man rebuilding his whole life from the ground up, one careful dollar at a time. He crossed the street, pressed that money into Nathaniel's hand, and held it there until Nathaniel's fingers closed around it whether he wanted them to or not. That covers the fee, the fare, and every excuse you rode in here with, Wade said, flat and final. It doesn't buy her. It frees her from you. Now go. Nathaniel looked down at the money in his hand. Looked at the street full of people watching him. Looked once more at Clara, and whatever he found written on her face wasn't what he'd ridden all this way expecting to find. He turned, got on his horse, and rode out of town. The cold morning just closed right back up behind him like he'd never even been there. The whole street let out a breath it didn't know it was holding. Wade turned, not toward the crowd, toward her. She was already looking right at him, hands loose at her sides. That exhaustion she'd been carrying since the moment she stepped off that train was gone from her eyes completely, replaced by something steadier. The look of a woman finally standing on ground that isn't going anywhere. He stood in front of her, the wind cutting cold between them. He'd crossed a street before he'd even decided to. He'd left coffee on a counter without making a single thing of it. And he'd just handed 2 years of hard-earned savings to another man without even blinking, because standing by and watching her be taken away was never something he was capable of doing. Wade wasn't a man who dressed things up to sound prettier than they were, and he wasn't about to start now. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "As my wife. If that's what you want." She looked at this man standing in front of her and took her time, took exactly as much space as choosing for herself required, and nobody around them rushed her one bit. The whole cold street just waited. "Yes," she said, quiet and complete, holding nothing back. "That's what I want." He let out a long, slow breath, and his hand found hers and closed around it right there in the middle of the street. Around them, the town slowly came back to life, boots hitting the boardwalk again, a door opening and shutting somewhere close by, that same steady wind rolling in off the hills, and that pale winter sky stretching out above all of it. The ranch, the dream he'd been saving 2 years toward, would just have to wait. But for the first time in a very long time, waiting didn't feel one bit like losing. Back at the house, Eli sat at the table with a short piece of wood and his father's smallest plane, working the edge down slow and careful, tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. Josie was sprawled on the floor with her ragdoll, deep in some very serious business that clearly didn't require any adult input whatsoever. From the stove came the smell of something with molasses in it, something new Clara was still figuring out, adjusting as she went. The kind of smell that sinks right into the walls of a kitchen and just stays there for years and years. The door opened. Cold air rushed in, followed by the sound of Wade's boots on the step, the sound of a man who knows he's expected home now and has stopped taking that for granted even for a second. Josie lifted her ragdoll briefly in his direction as a greeting and went right back to her business. Eli glanced up at his dad standing in the doorway, then looked back down at his work and kept right on going. But there was something different in that look now, something that hadn't been there back at the start of all this. Wade hung up his coat, walked over to the stove, and stood beside Clara looking at what was cooking. She held the spoon out to him without a word. He tasted it, thought it over slow and easy, then looked at her. She took the spoon right back. "I know," she said. "More molasses." The corner of his mouth twitched up. He went and hung his coat properly and left her to it. Up on the shelf above the window, that old sewing basket sat exactly where it had always sat. The late afternoon light came through the glass, found the wooden lid, and just rested there, warm and still. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees at the edge of the property. The horse shifted around in its pen. Somewhere past the tree line, a bird called out once, long and easy. And that little cabin held on to its warmth like it wasn't waiting on anybody. Not anymore. And that right there is the story of Clara Voss, a woman who showed up in a strange town with nothing but a bag and a backbone, and walked away with absolutely everything that actually matters in this life. If this one hit you the way it hit me, drop a comment and let me know. And if you want more stories just like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a whole lot more where this came from.